Hello and welcome to another Times Radio members question and answer. Now today we're answering comments from our channel members on Frontline episodes and other videos about the war in Ukraine and its impact in the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram. I present Times Radio Frontline, but I also comment on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, cyber, terrorism, and anything else that people ask me to comment on different channels around the world. So let's get straight into your points. First point comes from Stephen. Stephen, you say, why would the EU not provide a sovereign guarantee to Euroclear in order to get over the final block on releasing the Russian funds they hold? That's quite a technical question, Stephen. And, I think Euroclear themselves are under a degree of political pressure from the Belgian government and potentially behind closed doors from other governments. From what I understand, and I'm not a financial expert on this, but the concern that there is amongst different governments is the precedents that it would set. So by securing the Russian funds and taking them away from sovereign Russian control is different from freezing them. And there's a danger that if this precedent is set, then the same thing could be done with funds from European countries or the UK or the United States in different parts of the world if a bloc got together and decided that they wanted to freeze those funds. So it's this domino effect that is making people nervous. Now, you're speaking to Bill Browder, who is on Times Radio Frontline fairly frequently. He says the precedent's been set because we've already started to use the interest payments that there are against these funds that are being held in the bank, and those have been given to Ukraine. So it is not much more from a legal perspective to go and get the funds themselves. So whether it's down to the EU not providing a sovereign guarantee to Euroclear or not, I'm not sure. And therefore, that is probably beyond my level of financial competence. But I think if the political will was there from all the different countries, then it would be easily done. The precedents it sets could be very interesting, and the longer term implications are something that I think governments are trying to work out. At the moment, there's cash flowing into Ukraine. So, and it's coming from European countries, it's coming from NATO countries, and it's still coming from the United States. So I think the coalition of the willing is working, and I think everyone has got their eyes on the frozen Russian funds as a way of getting some of this money back. But let's see what happens. Next point comes from Nick. Nick, can you say a question on the nuclear piece? Does the increase in the number of weapons confer even an intimidatory marginal advantage when even a minute fraction of all the nuclear weapons on Earth now would be more than sufficient to end life on Earth with no advantage to anyone if humankind is wiped out? Nick, you're right. You're 100% right. We could destroy the Earth several times over with the nuclear weapons that are owned at the moment. Countries that have got smaller stocks of nuclear weapons, and here in particular China, is increasing their stocks because they want to have the same number as the United States and as Russia, so they've got the same number of warheads. It's I don't want to say what it is, but it's a measuring process where they're just trying to suggest that theirs is as big as everyone else's. The one thing about nuclear weapons is, ever since they've been invented, the threat of mutually assured destruction and the promise of no first use has kept us safe. Until we can de-invent something, and that is physically impossible, then we have to rely on this mutually assured destruction. The worrying bit is that countries are now withdrawing from the limitation treaties that were there, that were bringing an extra degree of peace. And there's an awful lot of rattling the nuclear saber, as we hear from Russia with their Poseidon nuclear torpedo or their Skyfall nuclear-powered cruise missile, and China building up its stocks, and then Donald Trump turning around and saying that he's going to restart testing again. And of course, we've got Kim Jong-un in North Korea with his increasing nuclear ambitions. There's more chance of a mistake happening somewhere. Whether that mistake would lead to nuclear Armageddon or not, I don't think so if it did happen. But we should be concerned. Adam, next point from you. Interesting. Without electricity, Putin won't be able to spread his lies, will he? Yes, and I think you're pointing at the fact that the Ukrainians are attacking some of the power grid around Russia in the same way that Russia is attacking the power grid around Ukraine. I do think, however, that the Russian power system will have sufficient robustness in it. It is so huge that the Ukrainians aren't going to be able to take the electricity down, and therefore cut off the propaganda that's coming out of the Russian state media machine in the way that's there. But there needs to be something to stop him spreading his lies. I think Ukraine taking the war into Russia, and especially attacking the fuel supplies, the average Russian is now beginning to realize that there is something going on that the government doesn't have control over. That is something that will be concerning Putin even more, and he will want to keep spreading his lies to keep some form of control. Let's see what happens next. Marty, next point from you. You say Ukraine is getting better, but they still got elements of the old system in their command structure. I think those structures are responsible for holding on to Pokrovsk or their surroundings for too long, i.e. not letting some hundreds of soldiers get out from encroaching Russian assaults by drones. They did a great job defending for over a year longer than anyone expected Pokrovsk to stand. Now it may be too late to get out. Marty, you make a number of interesting points there, and you're talking about, I think, the analysis of the regionally based command and control structure that was there, as opposed to the new core-based structure that the Ukrainians are trying to bring in. And yes, I think it is the elements of the old structure that are forcing the Ukrainians into this static defense, and part of Pokrovsk is in there. But Pokrovsk itself is interesting. The Ukrainians are holding on to the territory, and it has lost any strategic importance. As a logistic route, as a rail hub, and all of that's been destroyed. In American parlance, rubbleized. So the Russians aren't going to be able to exploit it properly. The city itself is just a pile of rubble, and you have to question why the Ukrainians are holding on to it, and why the Russians are putting so many people into trying to attack it. From the Russian perspective, I think it has become symbolic, and it's an emotional requirement for them to take Pokrovsk and prove that they can do something, because I think they feel that there was a failure if they didn't take it. For the Ukrainians, they're holding on to it, and they're causing the Russians 500, 600, 700 casualties a day just attacking into Pokrovsk. And whilst they're doing that, that is bleeding the Russians dry and is fixing them in one particular place. But you're completely right. At some stage, the Ukrainians need to make a decision before this cauldron that's closing around the outskirts of Pokrovsk closes, and they can't get some very experienced troops out from the city with their equipment and all the rest of it. That's a careful balancing act that the military commanders have to make. And whether the commanders in the regionally based command and control system have got that ability because it's a maneuverist idea, or whether it would require other commanders to come in and potentially take over from them, I don't quite know, but it's interesting to watch. Pokrovsk will fall at some stage, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has been a disaster. They fixed the Russians in place for over 18 months. In the same way, Bakhmut, when it fell, it was, I would consider a success for the Ukrainians, because again, they fixed the Russians in place for over a year, causing huge casualties. And the Ukrainians will have defensive positions that they can fall back onto to fix the Russians once again, whilst the Ukrainians are then using that time to attack at the operational level and undermine Russia's ability to continue to support the war. But Pokrovsk is interesting. Next point comes from Walter. Walter, you're going to the other side of the world. You say Venezuela transports drugs, etc., into the United States. I think Putin sticks his head into Venezuela against the Trump America. Now it's basically game over for Putin and the Russian Kremlin. That's your expert analysis. Walter, I think you are spot on. And with the Russians supplying weapons into Venezuela, I think Donald Trump will be getting very frustrated at that. And it wouldn't surprise me if Donald Trump then takes the gloves off in his support for Ukraine. What's going to happen in Venezuela or not, I don't know. It's interesting. I do think Donald Trump will try and do something to create the conditions for regime change. He's building up one of the biggest military packages that there has ever been in the Caribbean. And you don't do that and keep it there without plans to do something with it, because it's hugely expensive on manpower. And as Donald Trump keeps saying, money, and he's got no one else paying for this. So let's see what happens. Randy, you come in with the next one. You remember Nigeria asking for US military aid to combat out of control Islamists, and Obama turning them down, didn't he? Yes, Randy, you're right. I think they did. However, I think Obama turned them down because we look at the US as the global policeman, but as soon as you start to get involved in battles, even against known terror organizations, such as Boko Haram or ISIS-backed groups that are operating through Nigeria and all the rest of it, every little operation you get involved in, you have to be prepared to take it through to the end, and you become fixed in the world, firefighting everything. And even a country as big as the United States doesn't have the resources to do that. Nigeria's got plenty of money, and they should be able to do that themselves. They just need a bit of backbone delivered to them, which is always difficult in many of the African nations because of the levels of corruption and elsewhere. So I think it was probably right to turn down Nigeria's request for assistance and military assistance and not put troops on the ground, because you want an end state, and nobody can define the end state. That's the problem that we're seeing elsewhere. And then final point again from Marty. Marty, you say that the reports about 300 Russians inside Pokrovsk, a city that once had 60,000 people 3 years ago and 65,000 before part of the Donetsk Oblast was taken over by separatists in 2014. Pokrovsk hasn't been taken back then. Even now, it's been defended for years into this war. Will Ukraine be able to hold on to it? And I don't assume so. There will be more defensive lines further back to fall to. Marty, you're 100% right. And that's effectively what I said when I discussed Pokrovsk earlier. I think Ukrainians have to understand the point at which they say it's better to withdraw our troops and keep as many possible so we can use them again at the next defensive line. And I would assume, I hope they have made preparations for a fallback position, and they can tie the Russians up again for another year or so, and keep doing that. The Ukrainians have got the space to trade space for time, and that time will allow them to then further attack Russia's ability to continue to fund the war, its ability to manufacture equipment and elsewhere. We're already getting reports of the Russian main tank manufacturers starting to lay people off and cutting their production rates and everything else. And we've seen the impact of the attacks on the Russian oil and gas infrastructure. So, yes, Pokrovsk will fall at some stage, but I don't see that as necessarily being something that is a failure for the Ukrainians. I think holding on to it for 18 months has been a real success for the Ukrainians. So anyway, thank you for watching this week's question and answer and posting your questions. Remember, if you want access to our exclusive videos and have your questions answered, please sign up for Times Radio membership. And Frontline is also available on your favourite podcast channel. Just go onto there and search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.